Welcome back to the hang gliding files. Today we're going to continue our series on the weather in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Today's video is going to be all about how to set up your weather. You're about to go flying in your brand new hang glider. You have a site all picked out that you want to fly, so what's next? Well, choosing your weather, of course. For hang glider flying, this is very important that you get this right to have an enjoyable flight. You have three basic choices. You can use real weather using the current date and time. You can use real weather and change the date and time, but still get real weather. And the last one is using a weather preset. This video will be about how I set up my weather settings when I go hang gliding in the simulator. There is more than one valid scenario. It all depends on what you want to fly, when you want to fly, how you want to fly, and who you're flying with. Everything must be considered, but there is no right answer. It's just a sliding scale of right. So before we get in and we start showing all the different ways to set up weather, the very first thing that you need to do is make sure that in your Microsoft Flight Simulator settings that you have the turbulence setting turned on to realistic. This is the only mandatory weather setting that you must have to set in any of the soaring scenarios for this simulator. If you're not using realistic turbulence, you're not flying realistic thermals. Also, I'd like to review some of my history with simulated gliding, and it'll basically define how I have my historical bias about this subject. There are now, and were at some point, multiple soaring simulators. These have all had soaring injected into them as opposed to having soaring derived from the weather. And here's what I mean by that. They built thermal engines and ridge lift algorithms and then built their cloud rendering to match these algorithms. In other words, you get clouds because the thermal engine puts them there. It doesn't simulate weather. They simulate thermal markers. You need to have this context to understand why Microsoft Flight Simulator operates differently, and therefore you should expect something different. So I'm going to go through some examples of other soaring simulators or flight simulators that have soaring in them, just so that we can have a little background. First up is going to be XPlane 12. It has real weather inputs into it using METAR information, but METARs are very low fidelity to actual soaring weather. They don't have a lot of details about what atmospheric conditions exist that would affect soaring, but they do produce weather in the same way as a weather preset in Microsoft Flight Simulator. But soaring in this simulator mostly uses the classic preset method. Not many pilots fly here, but they can. The big soaring simulator is Condor, and it's a simulator that was built specifically for soaring sailplanes. It uses presets and creates clouds, but never weather. Built specifically to simulate thermals and ridge lift, this simulator will provide excellent soaring conditions every time, very predictable. Then there's FSX. At one point, it had real weather inputs using METAR information, but that service was shuttered more than a decade ago. It had no thermal and or ridge lift algorithms in it at all. Soaring basically was not possible. Now I know quite a bit about FSX because the hang gliding files started with this simulator. There was an add-on product called Cumulus X that injected thermals and ridge lift, and as a result of that, clouds into this simulator. It could do this because the simulator has a weather API. We, and many others, did some of the very first simulated hang gliding using this combination. But we went a step further, and we built our own real weather injection system into the sim by saving and reading historical METAR ratings from the web and then injecting these back into the sim when we were flying. Cumulus X took it from there to produce thermals, and the FSX produced the weather. Inside the weather, the Cumulus X generated thermal clouds, so we got both. And this illustrates the difference between Microsoft Flight Simulator and all other gliding simulators. Microsoft Flight Simulator had to add thermal convection cycle code and ridge lift code, basically the equivalent of Cumulus X, to their already existing simulated weather model. This provided the necessary components for soaring flight. But existing soaring simmers expected this simulator to behave in the same way that all the other sims did. In other words, that thermals were the priority and clouds were derived from that priority. They expected no thermals outside of clouds, and all clouds should indicate lift. And any area outside of clouds should indicate sink. I would ask you to watch the Williams Soaring Center video included in the links below. It provides great information about what real soaring weather expectations are. The best quote in this is, "Fly the soaring you have and not the soaring you want." Microsoft Flight Simulator is a weather-first model, and then thermals and ridge lift fit into that weather. This is the only proper sequence of events, and only Microsoft Flight Simulator even attempts to do it. Now, it has issues, but it is by far the most realistic and closest to reality in my humble opinion. Keep this in mind as we move into setting up the weather. We're setting up weather and letting thermals and ridge lift generate from there. We are not setting up thermal conditions. All right, enough with the history. Let's get on to how I do weather in Microsoft Flight Simulator. I will explain to you my delusional concepts in setting up weather. You can agree or disagree. I don't care really. I don't care if you think I'm wrong or not. This is just how I do it. You can do it however you want. I'll start with what I think is the best way, and that's using real weather. Using real time in the simulator. That means date and time. Hands down, clear winner every time. You get infinite variety, infinite changes over time and distance, and it forces you to have a challenge every single time you fly. Every single time. So we'll go over the pros of using this type of weather configuration. Every flight is different and challenging. Conditions change during the flight, so the weather is never stagnant. When you fly in a multiplayer mode with other pilots, it's actually very, very easy. There's actually nothing to do. You don't have to set a date and time or seasons. You don't have to sync your cloud development. You don't have to sync wind settings. Everybody faces the exact same conditions throughout the flight, no matter when they start or join. And you can fly against other real pilots in the same conditions. Think about competitions. Flying the competition tasks in the same weather would be a great, awesome thing to do. Flying in a fixed weather preset would be, of course, well, not awesome. The cons for flying in real weather are it's harder to find a flyable site for the current weather conditions. This is because of the time of day at the actual site that you're trying to fly. Could be many, many time zones away from your actual time zone. trying to fly in a flyable season. It may be winter where you are, but summer somewhere else, or the opposite. And then the last is trying to figure out what the wind variability is. And hang gliding needs to have the wind blowing into the hill in the proper direction for you to launch correctly. And that's a problem sometimes. For me then, the next best thing is to use real weather, but to modify the time and the date to suit your site situation. The pros of this is every flight is still different and challenging, and the conditions do change during the flight, so the weather isn't stagnant. But flying in multiplayer mode with other pilots, it's still easier to coordinate than using a preset. You do have to still set the date and time with everybody, but you don't have to sync your cloud development, and you don't have to sync your wind settings. Everybody voices the same conditions throughout the flight, no matter when they start or join, if the date and time have been matched. The cons of this type of weather is you might be flying in nighttime conditions during daytime hours, which sounds bad, but all this really does is it sets the wind and clouds, and you still get clouds at night, and you still get weather at night. And the simulator will simulate daytime conditions even though it's being fed nighttime weather information. And here we see that we use the widget to switch to a different launch site just because we're using real weather and real wind, but the wind wasn't coming in on our original launch, so we chose a different launch that has the wind coming straight in. Well, now we'll talk about what I think is the easiest way of using weather presets. And that is to use the standard hang gliding file weather presets that are included in the widget. These standard weather presets are based on cloud layers, types, and formations. There are a lot of them, but they are not infinite. These conditions typically have built into them underlying humidity and wind level gradients that go along with them. They create realistic, real-world looking clouds and weather conditions. And these are for weather's sake and not for soaring's sake. We provide these weather presets for you, and we will discuss them in detail later. The pros for using the hang gliding files weather presets is each of them are good for any place on Earth. They're good for any site location, as the layers are all in AGL. And last, everyone has them, so no need for everyone to download and install and manage a huge inventory library of weather presets. The cons, well, they're always there. This is counterproductive to pilots that want to only have a minimum number of presets in their sim at any given time. To use the weather presets, you need to adjust for date and time. So this defines the seasons define the sun exposure, and sun exposure and time of day determines the temperature. Now you can adjust the temperature, but it has a huge effect on thermal creation, and you shouldn't really mess with temperature. But you do need to adjust for site specifics, such as wind direction and wind speed. These presets are then subject to the same procedural weather changes that Microsoft Flight Simulator puts on all weather presets, and these changes are calculated based on the start time, and everyone must start at the identical same time to get identical results. Well, now I'll talk about what I consider to be the wrong way. And that is a site and or day crafted weather preset. Now for everyone else on the planet, this is the normal way. It's how everybody does it. The pros for this type of thing is everyone does it this way, so it's a standard way to do things. You can soar every time because it is made to be soarable. You don't have to set anything or change anything. It's all done for you. You control the installation of what presets you have or don't have. And if you have limited time or patience, then this is for you. Cons. You need to install them into your sim for every flight. This leads to a huge inventory of possible presets that you have to manage, quite possibly files you will never ever use more than once. Typically, they have some completely unrealistic values set into them. High temperatures are used to force massive thermal conditions. High winds at low altitudes facilitate extreme ridge lift. High winds aloft facilitate fast downwind runs. Excessive cloud cover or cloud type to make thermal convection everywhere. But you still need to adjust for date and time, and it has the same procedural weather change pattern as all presets. And another con is that it's always soarable. It's so good, so planned, that the glider could do the task by itself without any pilot skills whatsoever. It's like free candy. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about a way of setting weather that does not exist. And that's to use historical real weather. Imagine if you could record a section of weather for a date and time range and geographic location area, and then call back later and play that over again in the background while you fly. In this way, you would get all the benefits of real weather, but none of the cons. You could fly in the same conditions repeatedly and still have variability. You could fly past competition days with predefined tasks as a form of challenges or even creating online comps. You could set up multiplayer events where it would be not a matter of when you started or joined, as the weather would be tied to time of day and geography, not when you joined the session. The pros for this type of thing is all the benefits of real weather without the constraints, and the con, it doesn't exist. No APIs exist in Microsoft Flight Simulator to modify the weather conditions, even if you had the data. Well, let's go over the steps again, or what it takes to set up good, usable weather. First thing you're going to do is always try to use the real weather in the real time. That may work, it may not. It might be dark, or it might not be a good time of day, or the weather's just not good. But if it is good, but it's dark, turn off the real time and just set it to a good time of day for soaring. You can also change the month and year. But leave on the real weather, even if it's nighttime weather. Weather is weather. The sim will generate lift according to the temp and the sun. If it's still not good weather, turn off the real weather, set your date and time, and just pick a hang gliding file preset. They're not site specific, so you can choose any one of the weather presets and they should work for any site. Once you do that, if the wind isn't right, then you can change the wind direction. And if you have to, you can change the wind speed if that's needed for ridge soaring. Optionally, you can change the temperature, but we highly recommend that you don't. In conclusion, we'll just talk about weather-centric soaring. The soaring conditions will always be dictated by the weather. Within that current weather, however, and however that weather is created, the simulator will always create the same soaring conditions. Thermals are always available, but they're not always active. Activation and strength dependent on ground cover, sun strength, temperature, the sun angle, and a lot of other things. Ridge lift is always there as long as the wind conditions are conducive to it. Lift and sink are found everywhere, just like in real life. Thermals do go all the way up to cloud base, but not all clouds have thermals. Shadows on the ground will stop thermals, but they can also indicate lift. Thermals also occur in blue sky with no with no clouds. It happens every day. And also thermals can reach higher than the cloud base itself. That's dependent on humidity and temperature and a lot of other things. It happens every day. Well, that's it for this video. I hope you liked it. We've got a few more weather videos coming up, and you might be interested in those, so like and subscribe to make sure you get those when they come out. Anyway, see you on the hill. Later.